They are influencing you right now, and the terrifying part is that you probably have no idea it is even happening, because the most dangerous psychological tricks are not the loud ones or the obvious ones, but the invisible ones that quietly shape your thoughts, your decisions, and even your sense of reality without you ever realizing someone else is pulling the strings behind the curtain. Every day, you think you are choosing what to believe, what to want, and how to feel. But in many cases, those thoughts were planted long before you became aware of them, and the person who planted them does not need to be a villain, a criminal, or even someone who hates you, because it could be your coworker, your manager, a stranger online, a brand, an influencer, or even a close friend who has learned these psychological patterns through observation and repetition rather than formal study. The reason this works so well is because the human brain runs on shortcuts, automatic responses, and emotional triggers that evolved to help you survive in a dangerous world. But in the modern world, those same survival instincts can be hijacked to make you comply, agree, spend, forgive, follow, and surrender your power without resistance. The scariest part of this is not the existence of these techniques, because knowledge in itself is neutral, but the fact that most people walk around completely unaware of them, like sleepwalkers in a crowded room full of skilled illusionists who know exactly which emotional buttons to press to make them dance. One of the first and most common dark psychological tricks used every single day is something called emotional anchoring, and it happens so subtly that your mind automatically connects feelings to certain people, words, places, or experiences without you ever consciously choosing to do so. Emotional anchoring is the process of linking an emotional response to a specific stimulus, which means that someone does not have to control you directly if they can control how you feel in their presence. For example, if every time someone around you makes you laugh, supports you, or shows you a moment of affection, they also sneak in a request, an opinion, or a suggestion, your mind starts to associate that person with safety and pleasure. And over time, you begin to lower your defenses without realizing it. You stop questioning their motives. You stop challenging their ideas, and you start internalizing their perspective as if it were your own. The danger of emotional anchoring is that it can also work in the opposite direction, because someone can make you feel anxious, guilty, small, or incompetent, and yet present themselves as the only source of comfort, which creates a loop of psychological dependency that you mistake for trust, love, or loyalty. Another daily dark psychology trick that most people fall victim to is the illusion of scarcity, which is when something is made to appear rare, limited, or temporary in order to force you into a rushed emotional decision. When you believe that something is about to disappear, your brain switches from rational thought to survival mode because your primitive instincts are wired to fear loss more than they value gain. This is why phrases like limited time only 2 spots left, or this is your last chance are so effective, because they trigger a panic response that tells you to act first and think later. In real life, outside of marketing, people also use scarcity on an emotional level by threatening to withdraw attention, affection, opportunities, or relationships if you do not behave the way they want. When someone makes you feel like they can easily be taken away from you, replaced, or lost forever, you start changing yourself just to keep them around, and you call it compromise, when in reality it is psychological pressure wearing a friendly mask. Then there is the subtle but extremely powerful trick of social proof, which works because human beings are wired to follow the crowd even when the crowd is wrong. You see this every single day in group settings, workplaces, friend circles, and social media, because when a large number of people agree on something, your brain assumes that it must be safe, and correct. This part of your mind does not want to be the outsider, the odd one out, or the rebel, because in ancient times, not belonging to the tribe meant death. So your nervous system evolved to prioritize acceptance over truth. Dark psychological manipulators understand this, so they surround their ideas, products, or opinions with the appearance of popularity, agreement, and validation, even if it is fake, exaggerated, or purchased. Because once you see other people approving, your resistance automatically drops. You feel pressure to agree so that you are not seen as difficult, negative, or unintelligent. And slowly but surely, your individuality begins to fade into whatever narrative is being presented as normal. Closely connected to social proof is the technique of authority manipulation, which happens when someone positions themselves as an expert, a leader, or a superior, so that you hesitate to question them. From childhood, you were taught to respect teachers, elders, doctors, bosses, and officials, and basic conditioning never really leaves you, even in adulthood. So when someone speaks with confidence, status, or perceived expertise, your mind gives their words extra weight and reduces your critical thinking. Even if something inside you feels wrong, uncomfortable, or unclear, you push that feeling down because challenging authority feels dangerous and disrespectful. Dark psychology does not require real power, because someone only needs the appearance of power to influence how easily you surrender your own judgment. Once you believe someone is more knowledgeable than you, they can rewrite your reality sentence by sentence, and you will thank them for it rather than resist it. Perhaps one of the most damaging and least talked about psychological tricks is subtle gaslighting, which is the process of slowly making you doubt your own memory, emotions, and perception of reality. Unlike obvious lies, gaslighting is not direct, because it is designed to confuse rather than confront. Someone might say, "You are being too sensitive. That never happened." Or, "You are imagining things," even when you clearly remember what you saw, heard, or felt. Over time, this repeated denial makes you mistrust yourself. And once you no longer trust your own mind, you become easy to control. You start asking others what is real, what is okay, and what is acceptable, instead of listening to your own internal compass. The most tragic part is that many people stay inside emotionally manipulative relationships for years, not because they are weak, but because their strongest tool, their mind, has been slowly turned against them. These tricks do not only happen in toxic relationships or manipulative environments, because they are embedded in everyday interactions, entertainment, advertising, politics, friendships, and even family dynamics. And that is why awareness is your first and most important defense. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand the trigger, you can choose your response instead of reacting automatically. Awareness turns you from a target into an observer, from a follower into a thinker, and from a victim into someone who cannot be easily controlled. And this is only the surface of what is happening around you every day. Because the next level of dark psychology is not about how they influence your emotions, but how they rewrite your identity without you ever noticing it is happening. Once your emotions have been influenced and your trust in your own perception has been weakened, the next silent step in dark psychology is the gradual rewriting of your identity, which is one of the most powerful methods of control. Because when someone can shape how you see yourself, they no longer have to directly tell you what to do. Your identity is the story you tell yourself about who you are, what you deserve, what you are capable of, and where you belong in the world. And most people believe that this story comes entirely from within, even though it is shaped by thousands of small experiences, comments, comparisons, and suggestions from the outside world. When a person or environment consistently treats you as if you are a certain type of person, even subtly, your mind starts to adapt to that role without resistance, because the brain wants internal consistency more than it wants truth. If you are constantly talked down to, ignored, or overlooked, you slowly begin to believe that you are less important, less intelligent, or less worthy, even if you were once confident and full of potential. If you are constantly praised only for specific things, such as obedience, appearance, or productivity, you start building your self-worth around those narrow labels instead of your full human value. This is how people end up living versions of themselves that were never truly chosen, but rather silently assigned to them by repeated psychological influence. One of the most common identity-shaping tricks is comparison manipulation, which works by quietly placing you in a mental competition with other people so that you start evaluating your life through a distorted lens. Social media has become one of the most powerful tools for this, because you are constantly seeing the highlights of other people's lives while living in the unfiltered reality of your own. When someone wants to control you or sell something to you, they may not tell you that you are lacking because that would be too obvious and would trigger your defenses, but instead they simply show you a version of what you could be, and your own mind fills in the painful gap. You begin to feel behind, incomplete, not enough. And once that feeling takes root, you become far more open to influence. You start looking for external solutions, external approval, and external direction, which gives power to whoever is offering the illusion of improvement, acceptance, or success. This is how people get locked into toxic cycles of overworking, overspending, overpleasing, and overperforming, in the hope that one day they will finally become enough in the eyes of the world. Another deeply rooted psychological tactic is conditional acceptance, which is when someone makes you feel valued only when you behave in a certain way or meet a specific expectation. Human beings crave belonging more than almost anything else, because isolation has always been linked to danger in our evolutionary history. So the threat of emotional or social rejection is one of the strongest forms of control that exists. When affection, respect, or recognition is given only under certain conditions, your brain learns to self-correct its behavior in order to avoid the pain of disconnection. You start monitoring yourself, editing your thoughts, filtering your personality, and suppressing your real feelings just to maintain a sense of safety. Over time, this creates a fractured internal world, because the person you show to others is no longer aligned with who you really are. The most dangerous part is that this process can happen so gradually that you do not even notice the moment you abandoned your true self, because it did not happen all at once, but in small, quiet compromises that felt harmless at the time. Closely tied to conditional acceptance is the technique of guilt programming, which is used to control behavior by making you feel responsible for other people's emotions, problems, or happiness. When someone says things like, "After all I've done for you, you are breaking my heart," or "I thought you were a good person," they are not simply expressing feelings, because they are planting a narrative in your mind that you are the cause of their pain. Once you accept that narrative, you feel morally obligated to sacrifice your own needs, boundaries, and well-being in order to fix something that was never truly your responsibility. This is especially powerful in families, relationships, and workplaces, because the closer the connection, the stronger the guilt. Over time, guilt becomes an internal voice that continues to regulate you even when the original person is not present, which means the psychological control has become self-sustaining inside your own mind. Then there is the trick of future faking, which is when someone paints a beautiful, detailed vision of a future together in order to gain your trust, commitment, or energy in the present. This is not simple dreaming or planning, because it is a strategic use of hope to keep you emotionally invested in a situation that may never actually become reality. When someone talks about all the things you will do together, all the success you will share, or all the happiness that is coming one day, your brain releases emotional chemicals associated with love, safety, and belonging. Those emotions create a powerful bond, even if their actions in the present do not align with their promises. You stay because of the imagined future, not because of the current reality. And that imagined future becomes a psychological prison where you are voluntarily locked in by your own hope. Another silent but destructive method is the use of subtle humiliation, disguised as humor, advice, or honesty. When someone makes small comments about your intelligence, your body, your abilities, or your choices, and then laughs or claims they are just joking or just being real, it slowly chips away at your self-esteem while making it difficult for you to defend yourself. If you react, you are labeled as sensitive or dramatic, and if you stay silent, the message sinks deeper into your subconscious. Over time, you begin to internalize those jokes as truth, and you start repeating them to yourself even when the person is not around. This is one of the most painful forms of psychological influence, because it disguises harm as connection and cruelty as familiarity. While all of this is happening, another layer of influence is working in the background, and that is the manipulation of your attention. Wherever your attention goes, your energy flows, and whoever controls your attention indirectly controls the direction of your life. Modern algorithms, notifications, trends, news cycles, and endless streams of content are not just forms of entertainment, because they are shaping what you think about, worry about, desire, and value. The more your attention is scattered and overstimulated, the less time you have to think deeply, question patterns, or reconnect with your true self. When you are constantly distracted, you are easier to influence, easier to sell to, and easier to lead without resistance. A distracted mind is not a free mind, because freedom requires awareness, and awareness requires stillness. This is the uncomfortable truth that most people are never taught, because they grow up believing that control happens through force, rules, or obvious domination. When in reality, the most effective form of control is invisible and feels like normal life. It feels like routine, culture, tradition, expectations, and the way things are. And because it feels normal, it is rarely questioned. But the moment you step back and look at your life objectively, you may start to notice patterns that were placed there by influences you never consciously agreed to. However, knowledge of these patterns is not meant to fill you with fear or paranoia, because its true purpose is to give you back your power. Once you understand that these psychological forces exist, you can begin the slow and courageous process of deconstructing the parts of yourself that were built by manipulation and reconstructing the parts that are truly yours. And as this awareness grows, you begin to see something even more unsettling. Because the question is no longer just who is influencing you, but why this system of influence is everywhere, and who truly benefits the most from the way your mind has been trained to operate. Because the next dark psychology layer goes beyond individuals. It goes into systems. Once you begin to understand that influence is not just coming from individuals, but from carefully designed systems, you start to notice that your daily environment is not as neutral as you once believed. Because every space you enter, every app you open, every building you walk through, and every service you use has been shaped with psychological intent in mind. This is not always done with malicious purpose, because sometimes it is about profit, productivity, or efficiency, rather than direct harm. But the effect on the human mind is still the same, because it quietly guides your behavior down paths that benefit someone else more than they benefit you. Lighting, music, colors, layout, temperature, signage, language, and even the way information is ordered play a role in how you feel, how long you stay, how much you spend, and how likely you are to agree with what is presented to you. Once you notice this, it becomes impossible to ignore the fact that your choices are often being influenced long before you even start thinking about them. One of the most powerful environmental psychological tools is called choice architecture, which is the subtle art of organizing options in a way that makes one path feel easier, safer, or more logical than the others. When you walk into a store or scroll through a website, you are not being shown options in a random order, because the most profitable or strategically important choices are often placed at eye level, at the top of the page, or after a carefully constructed emotional build-up. Even when you believe you are freely choosing between several options, the truth is that your attention is being guided like water flowing downhill into channels that were built long before you arrived. The human brain hates friction and loves simplicity, which means it will usually choose the path that requires the least amount of mental effort. Dark psychology and systems uses that natural tendency by making the desired choice convenient and the less desired choices inconvenient, confusing, or hidden altogether. Another deeper layer is found in the manipulation of time perception, which happens when an environment is designed in such a way that you either lose track of time or feel pressure from it. In certain places, such as casinos, shopping centers, and digital platforms, there are no clocks, no windows, and no natural indicators of the passing day. Because when you cannot feel the movement of time, you are more likely to continue spending, scrolling, playing, or consuming. On the other hand, in productivity-focused environments, everything may be structured around urgency, deadlines, countdowns, and constant reminders that you are running out of time, which keeps your nervous system in a mild state of panic that can be redirected into work, performance, and obedience. In both cases, your internal rhythm is being overridden by an external system that decides when you should act, rest, worry, or accelerate. Then there is the manipulation of language on a mass level, which is one of the most underestimated forces in shaping human thought. The words that are used in policies, headlines, mission statements, advertisements, and public conversations are carefully chosen not only to describe reality, but to frame it in a certain emotional light. When something is described as a security measure, it feels protective. But when the same thing is called surveillance, it feels threatening. When a job is labeled an opportunity, it feels positive. But when the same job is called labor, it can feel heavy and exhausting. By shifting a single word, entire emotional reactions can change. And when millions of people are exposed to the same language again and again, their perception of reality begins to align with the way it is described rather than the way it actually is. Repetition is another silent but extremely powerful system-level psychological technique, because the human brain equates familiarity with truth. When you hear the same idea, phrase, belief, or narrative repeated over and over, especially from different sources, your mind eventually stops questioning it and begins accepting it as fact. This is not because you fully analyzed it and agreed, but because your brain is designed to conserve energy, and constant re-evaluation of repeated information is exhausting. This is how certain beliefs, stereotypes, cultural norms, and false standards of success become deeply embedded in society because they are not challenged enough to break their hypnotic rhythm. Once something is normal, it becomes invisible. And once it becomes invisible, it becomes almost impossible to fight without conscious effort. One of the most unsettling realizations is how deeply reward systems have been embedded into modern life to train behavior, much like an invisible conditioning experiment. Likes, views, points, streaks, badges, promotions, bonuses, and public recognition all act as psychological rewards that trigger the same pleasure chemicals in your brain as food, affection, and physical safety. When your brain receives that reward, it wants more, so it repeats the behavior that led to it, whether that behavior is healthy for you or not. Over time, this can trap you in cycles of seeking validation, chasing productivity, or measuring your worth through external metrics that were never designed to care about your well-being. You start performing for the system, and the system rewards you just enough to keep you performing, like a psychological treadmill that never truly leads anywhere. Fear is also used on a collective scale, because a fearful population is easier to guide, control, and sell solutions to. When people are afraid, they do not think long-term. They think about immediate relief and protection. This is why news cycles, rumors, and social narratives often focus on threats, danger, crises, and division. When your mind is filled with fear, you are more willing to give up privacy, freedom, time, money, or autonomy in exchange for a feeling of safety. That safety may be temporary or even false, but the emotional relief feels real in the moment. And that is all the system needs to keep functioning. Even entertainment is not completely free from psychological influence, because the stories that are repeatedly told on screens and in music shape what you believe is possible, desirable, powerful, or respectable. When certain lifestyles, bodies, relationships, and personalities are endlessly celebrated, they slowly become the standard against which you measure yourself and others. Very few people stop to ask who benefits from this standard, who created it, and who is excluded or diminished by it. Instead, they simply try to fit into it, even when it costs them their authenticity, creativity, and mental peace. But despite how deeply these systems run, they are not unbreakable, because their power depends on your unawareness. The moment you start observing instead of simply participating, you create distance between yourself and the influence. That distance is where your power begins to return to you. Awareness creates choice, and choice creates freedom, even if that freedom is uncomfortable at first, because it forces you to question the life you have been silently guided into. As your awareness sharpens, another truth begins to rise to the surface, and that is that the most difficult psychological prison to escape is not built by others, but by the habits, beliefs, and internal voice that have already taken root inside you. Once you realize that external systems and people have been shaping your mind, the next unsettling truth is that the human brain is capable of sabotaging itself, and the most dangerous dark psychological patterns are often the ones you unknowingly enforce upon yourself every single day. These are habits, thoughts, and beliefs that feel natural, logical, or even morally right. But in reality, they are invisible chains, quietly reinforcing fear, doubt, and limitation. Your mind is constantly scanning for threats and rewards, for patterns that promise survival and acceptance. And if left unchecked, it will latch onto any narrative that keeps you safe from perceived danger, even when that safety is an illusion. One of the most common ways this manifests is through self-doubt, which is not just occasional uncertainty, but a chronic questioning of your abilities, your decisions, and even your worth, which creates a fertile ground for external influence. because a person who does not trust themselves is far easier to guide. Closely tied to self-doubt is the habit of overthinking, which initially seems like a tool for better decision-making, but in reality often traps you in loops of indecision and anxiety that leave your emotional energy drained and your attention scattered. When you overanalyze every interaction, every opportunity, and every failure, you are training your brain to focus on potential threats rather than actual possibilities, which keeps you from taking decisive action. Overthinking works in tandem with comparison, because your mind constantly measures your choices, achievements, and status against invisible benchmarks set by others, and each small perceived failure or shortcoming reinforces a narrative that you are not enough. This creates a cycle in which fear of judgment, failure, or rejection drives more overthinking, which in turn strengthens self-doubt, leaving you vulnerable to both internal and external influence without realizing it. Perfectionism is another internalized psychological trick, because it disguises control as self-improvement. On the surface, striving for excellence seems virtuous and productive, but perfectionism is built on fear. Fear of criticism, fear of failure, and fear of being rejected. When you constantly pressure yourself to meet impossibly high standards, you are essentially surrendering control to an invisible set of expectations, many of which are borrowed from the people, media, and systems that influenced you long before you knew you were listening. Perfectionism keeps you in a state of constant self-monitoring, editing, and suppressing, which exhausts your emotional and cognitive resources while maintaining the illusion that you are working towards success. Meanwhile, the actual measure of your worth becomes increasingly externalized, because perfectionism trains you to look for validation rather than trust your own judgment. Procrastination, paradoxically, is also a form of dark, psychological self-manipulation, because it is not merely laziness, but a coping mechanism triggered by fear, uncertainty, or internal conflict. Every time you delay a task, postpone a decision, or avoid confronting an uncomfortable emotion, you are practicing a form of self-control surrender, training your mind to choose immediate comfort over long-term growth. The pattern becomes self-reinforcing, because your brain experiences temporary relief when you avoid discomfort, which strengthens the habit while simultaneously increasing stress, anxiety, and a sense of inadequacy over time. Procrastination is rarely random. It is often the subconscious mind's way of protecting you from imagined threats, social judgment, or the emotional consequences of change. But it comes at the cost of your freedom, potential, and personal agency. Another subtle, internalized, dark psychological pattern is the creation of mental narratives that justify limiting beliefs. These are the stories you tell yourself about who you are, what you can achieve, and what is possible for your life. For example, you may say, "I'm just not the type of person who can succeed in that field," or "I'll never find someone who truly values me." And even though these statements feel factual, they are often internalized echoes of external influence, repeated expectations, or cultural programming. Your brain accepts these narratives because they are familiar, even if they are false, because familiarity feels safe and uncertainty feels dangerous. Once these mental narratives take root, they shape your decisions, your habits, and even your relationships. And you start living inside a self-imposed prison that feels like reality, while the rest of the world seems to operate with freedom and opportunity that you believe is unattainable. Then there is the trap of emotional suppression, which is the habit of pushing away feelings you deem unacceptable, inconvenient, or threatening. While suppressing anger, sadness, fear, or vulnerability may seem like self-discipline or maturity, Over time, it disconnects you from your true emotional self, which is the most intuitive and protective aspect of your mind. When emotions are ignored, they do not disappear. Instead, they accumulate silently, influencing your decisions, interactions, and behaviors in ways you may not consciously recognize. Suppressed emotions create blind spots, which are exactly what manipulators exploit, because a person disconnected from their inner compass cannot easily recognize when external influence is occurring. By numbing certain parts of yourself, you inadvertently hand over control to the very systems, people, and habits that have been guiding your life without your awareness. Compounding all of these patterns is the human tendency to rationalize or justify behavior, which often masks the influence you are under. Your mind is incredibly skilled at creating explanations for your choices, beliefs, and feelings, even if the real reason is unconscious influence or fear-based habit. You may convince yourself that you failed because of bad timing, lack of effort, or circumstance, while the deeper truth is that the cumulative effect of external and internal psychological patterns steered you away from optimal action. Rationalization feels empowering because it gives you a sense of conscious agency, but in reality, it can maintain the very limitations, habits, and self-sabotage that keep you trapped. The more skilled your mind becomes at rationalization, the less likely you are to question the subtle control that surrounds you, which is why awareness is not a one-time act, but a continual, deliberate practice. Awareness of these internal patterns is the critical turning point, because the moment you notice them, you start reclaiming your mental and emotional autonomy. Observation replaces automatic reaction, and curiosity replaces unquestioned belief, which allows you to begin breaking down the narratives, habits, and self-imposed rules that have been silently guiding your life. Awareness is like turning on a light in a dark room. Suddenly, what was once invisible becomes visible, and visibility is the first step toward choice. With observation, you can start noticing which thoughts belong to you and which were planted by others, which habits serve your true goals and which were inherited from fear, and which emotions are genuine versus manipulated responses to external influence. But even with internal awareness, there is a final, deeper layer of dark psychology that you must understand, because some of the most powerful tricks are hidden in relationships, social networks, and the ways people around you amplify influence without ever needing to confront you directly. These patterns extend the effects of external systems and internal habits into a web of interconnected influence that can subtly dictate social hierarchy, emotional loyalty, and behavioral conformity. Once you understand that influence is not only personal or internal, but also spreads through the network of people around you, you begin to see that human connection itself can become a powerful carrier of psychological conditioning, because emotions, beliefs, behaviors, and attitudes pass from one mind to another far more easily than most people realize. Human beings are not isolated thinkers, because their brains are wired for imitation, empathy, and synchronization, which means you naturally begin to mirror the tone, energy, vocabulary, and mindset of the people you spend the most time with. This is not something you consciously choose to do, because it is a deep neurological function designed to help tribes survive, bond, and stay cohesive in dangerous environments. In the modern world, however, that same instinct can make you highly susceptible to absorbing the fears, limitations, ambitions, prejudices, and values of your social environment without questioning whether those things truly align with who you want to become. One of the strongest social, psychological forces is emotional contagion, which refers to the way moods and attitudes spread through groups like invisible waves. If you spend time around people who complain, doubt themselves, criticize others, or see the world as hostile, your own mind slowly begins to adopt the same perspective, even if you originally felt hopeful, confident, or optimistic. This happens because your brain is constantly scanning for social cues in order to adapt and belong. And the more consistent the emotional environment, the more your own emotional baseline shifts to match it. Likewise, when you are around people who are focused, disciplined, curious, and growth-oriented, your mind begins to rise to meet that frequency, because the human brain is shaped by what it is repeatedly exposed to. The danger is that most people never choose their psychological environment consciously, because they simply stay with what is familiar, comfortable, or socially expected, not realizing that familiarity is not the same as safety or health. Another subtle but extremely powerful group-level psychological pattern is the fear of exclusion, which can make you betray your own values, silence your truth, and shrink parts of your identity just to stay included. When you are in a social group, your brain is always evaluating where you stand, how you are perceived, and how likely you are to be accepted or rejected. If the group's beliefs, behaviors, or expectations do not match your authentic self, you are forced into an internal conflict between honesty and belonging. In many cases, the fear of standing alone feels stronger than the discomfort of betraying yourself. So you begin to agree with things you do not truly support, laugh at jokes that make you uncomfortable, and go along with plans and decisions that do not align with your values. Over time, this repeated self-betrayal weakens your self-trust, which makes it even harder to break free from unhealthy group influence, because you no longer fully recognize your real voice. There is also a darker technique that operates in some social environments called triangulation, which happens when influence is exerted indirectly through a third party, rather than through open communication. This often looks like comparisons, rivalries, gossip, or subtle manipulation of relationships, where one person is used as a reference point to control another person's behavior. For example, someone may say, "Everyone else already agrees with me," or "They don't have a problem with this, why do you?" which makes you feel isolated and pressured to conform. Even when the statement is not true, your mind reacts to the fear of being the only one, because belonging is so deeply tied to your sense of safety. Triangulation creates division, insecurity, and competition, which weakens trust and strengthens control without requiring any direct force. In professional or creative spaces, there is an additional layer of psychological influence called performance conditioning, which links your sense of worth to your output, productivity, and usefulness to the group or system. When praise, opportunities, and respect are given primarily in response to what you produce rather than who you are, your mind begins to equate your human value with your performance. This makes you more likely to ignore exhaustion, sacrifice personal boundaries, and neglect your mental and emotional health in order to maintain your position and approval. Over time, you no longer ask what is good for you, because your only question becomes whether what you are doing is good enough for others. This is one of the most common ways people become controlled by environments that claim to offer success, recognition, or belonging, because the reward is tied to a part of the human psyche that craves validation above almost everything else. Then there is the role of unspoken rules, which are the invisible codes of behavior that exist in every friend group, family, culture, and organization. These rules are rarely written down, but they are strongly enforced through subtle reactions such as approval, silence, teasing, withdrawal, and judgment. You quickly learn what is allowed, what is risky, and what is forbidden, not through clear instruction, but through emotional feedback. When you step outside the unspoken rules, You may be met with discomfort, confusion, or slight rejection, which trains you to stay within invisible lines, even when they do not make logical or ethical sense. This creates environments where harmful, unhealthy, or irrational patterns continue, simply because no one feels safe enough to challenge them openly. A group does not have to be intentionally manipulative to reinforce dark psychological patterns, because habit and silence are often enough to sustain them. Another deeply impactful element is how relationships can reinforce your self-image, either positively or negatively. If people constantly see you as the quiet one, the troublemaker, the strong one, or the failure, your mind begins to adapt to that role because it provides a sense of consistency in the social world. Even when the label is painful or limiting, it still gives your brain a predictable identity, which can feel safer than the unknown. The longer you stay in an environment that sees you in a certain way, the more difficult it becomes to change, because any attempt to evolve threatens the psychological balance of the group. People who benefit from you staying the same may resist your growth, mock your efforts, or question your transformation, not necessarily because they are evil, but because your change forces them to confront their own stagnation, insecurities, and discomfort. This is why breaking free from psychological influence is not just an internal journey, but also a relational one, because you may find that some connections can only exist if you remain the version of yourself they are comfortable with. When you start to wake up, notice patterns, and set boundaries, some people will respond with confusion, backlash, or emotional manipulation, because your growth disrupts the dynamic that once benefited them. They may try to pull you back using guilt, nostalgia, anger, or emotional pressure, reminding you of how you used to be, or accusing you of changing for the worse, even if your change is actually healthier. This is another reason why many people stay unconscious, because awareness is not always rewarded by their environment, and it requires emotional strength to move toward clarity rather than approval. However, as painful and difficult as this realization can be, it is also one of the most empowering stages of awareness, because you begin to see that not everyone around you is meant to go where you are going. Some people are part of a chapter, not the entire story, and their presence in your life was shaped by the version of you that is now dissolving. This does not mean you must hate them or judge them, because they too are operating from their own conditioning, fears, and psychological patterns. But it does mean that your future depends on choosing relationships that reflect your truth, not your trauma, your growth, not your limitations, and your awareness, not your blindness. As your social environment begins to shift, you enter a vulnerable but powerful stage of psychological transformation, because you are no longer fully controlled by the outside, but you are not yet fully grounded in your new sense of self. This is the stage where intention becomes critical, because awareness alone is not enough to change your life. And without conscious direction, the mind can easily fall back into familiar patterns. You now stand at a mental crossroad where one path leads back into comfortable unconsciousness, and the other leads into uncomfortable freedom. As you begin to unlearn the psychological patterns that once controlled you, a strange thing happens, because the world does not suddenly become easier, but it does become clearer, and clarity is a double-edged sword. Awareness removes illusion, but it also removes comfort, because many of the stories you once told yourself to feel safe no longer work in the same way. You start to see how often people are acting from insecurity, fear, and unhealed wounds, rather than from logic or love. You start to notice how conversations are layered with hidden motives, how compliments sometimes contain control, how anger is often just pain wearing armor, and how kindness can sometimes be strategically placed to earn loyalty instead of expressing genuine care. This new vision can feel isolating at first because it creates a silent gap between you and those who remain unaware of the games being played. This is where many people make a dangerous mistake because they begin to see themselves as separate or superior. And while awareness does create difference, ego turns that difference into distance and judgment. The mind loves to create a new identity out of awakening, and that identity often sounds like, I see what others do not see, or I am not like the rest. And although it may feel empowering at first, it is just another psychological trap wearing the mask of intelligence. True psychological freedom does not isolate you from others, but gives you deeper compassion for them, because you realize that most people are not malicious. They are simply unconscious of the forces driving their behavior. You understand that if you had not become aware, you would very likely still be acting the same way. As awareness deepens, another subtle trick reveals itself, and that is the illusion of control. You begin to realize that part of the reason dark psychology works so well is because humans crave certainty in a world that is fundamentally uncertain. The need to know what will happen next, how people will behave, and how life will unfold drives many to try to control outcomes, relationships, and perceptions. This is the hidden root beneath manipulation, because when someone feels out of control inside, they try to control the outside world to calm that inner chaos. You may even find moments where you catch yourself trying to predict, shape, or steer someone's emotions or decisions, not out of cruelty, but out of your own unresolved fear of uncertainty. When you see this in yourself, it can be uncomfortable because it breaks the image you have of being the aware one. But it is also one of the most powerful moments of growth. The moment you recognize a pattern in yourself without excusing it or judging it is the moment you begin to break it. Self-honesty is the antidote to dark psychology, because manipulation cannot survive where the truth is brought into the light. You start to understand that the battle is not between you and the world, or you and other people, but between your conscious awareness and your unconscious programming. One of the ways the mind tries to maintain control is by creating narratives about the past that justify the present. You may tell yourself that you are guarded because people are dangerous, that you are distant because no one understands you, that you are harsh because the world is harsh, or that you are numb because you have been hurt too many times. While these statements may hold traces of truth, they also act as psychological armor that prevents healing and connection. Dark psychology thrives in unresolved stories, because as long as the wound stays open, the patterns connected to it continue to operate automatically. You begin to see that some of your strongest emotions are not actually responses to the present moment, but echoes from the past replaying through new faces, voices, and situations. When someone disappoints you, you may feel rejection that goes far deeper than the current situation warrants. When someone challenges you, you may feel anger that belongs to an old conflict that was never resolved. When someone shows kindness, you may feel suspicion that was born from betrayal long ago. Your nervous system does not know time because it only knows sensation and memory, so it reacts now as if the past is still happening. This is where true power begins to form, because instead of projecting your inner world onto others, you start pulling it back inward and questioning it. You ask yourself why a certain comment affected you so deeply, why a certain tone made you defensive, why a certain absence made you feel abandoned, or why a small failure made you feel worthless. Each question is like shining a light into a dark room inside your mind, and with each light, a little more of the unconscious becomes conscious. What was once an invisible force begins to become a visible pattern, and what is visible can be changed. You also become more careful with your words, because you realize that language is not just a tool for communication, but a tool for shaping reality. You notice how often people speak in absolutes, using words like always, never, everyone, and nothing, and how those words trap them in rigid emotional states. You begin choosing words that leave room for growth, complexity, and change. Instead of saying, I am like this, you start saying, sometimes I am like this. Instead of saying, they always hurt me, you start saying, they hurt me in that moment. These small shifts loosen the psychological chains that language once wrapped around you. Another important shift happens in your relationship with silence, because silence is where your true thoughts and emotions finally have room to speak. In a world full of noise, distraction, and constant stimulation, silence is often avoided. But it is in silence that patterns rise to the surface. When you stop filling every moment with sound, content, or conversation, you start hearing your own internal world more clearly. At first, this can be frightening, because it means facing thoughts and feelings you have ignored for years. But over time, silence becomes a sanctuary rather than a threat, because within it, you reconnect with your intuition, your values, and your authentic self. You start to feel less need to prove yourself, defend yourself, or impress others, because your sense of identity is no longer being built from external reactions. You realize that most of the pressure you once felt came from trying to live up to invisible expectations created by other people's fears and desires. As those expectations lose their grip, you begin to act from a place that feels quieter, steadier, and more honest. You may speak less, observe more, and choose your relationships more carefully. This does not make you cold, distant, or detached, but rather more intentional. You begin to see connection not as something to chase, but as something to cultivate slowly through trust, mutual respect, and emotional safety. You stop being drawn to intensity and start valuing consistency. You stop mistaking chaos for passion and start recognizing peace as a sign of real alignment. This is a profound shift because it breaks one of the strongest hooks of dark psychology, which is the addiction to emotional highs and lows. As you stabilize within yourself, your energy changes, and people begin responding to you differently without even knowing why. Some will feel drawn to your calm because it feels like safety. Some will feel threatened by it because it exposes their own inner chaos. Some may even try to pull you back into old patterns because your change disrupts the roles they were used to playing. This is where your strength is tested, not through confrontation, but through consistency. You remain who you are becoming without needing others to understand it or approve it. You realize that the final form of psychological power is not dominance over others, but mastery over yourself. It is the ability to witness your thoughts without becoming them, to feel your emotions without being controlled by them, and to move through the world without losing yourself in it. This is something that cannot be taken away, bought, or manipulated, because it is built from within and protected by awareness. And as this inner strength takes root, you approach one last truth, one that changes everything. Because the final section is not about what others do to you. It is about the kind of mind you choose to build moving forward. The last and perhaps most important realization is that the mind is not a passive vessel for influence, but a garden that requires conscious tending. Because the thoughts you allow, the habits you cultivate, and the attention you give ultimately determine the life you experience. If you fill your mental space with fear, comparison, and reaction, You remain under the influence of patterns that were never designed for your freedom. But if you cultivate awareness, intentionality, and discernment, you create a mind that acts as a filter rather than a sponge, absorbing what is useful and rejecting what is harmful. This is not something that happens overnight, because the brain is naturally resistant to change and comfort is addictive. But every step you take toward clarity rewires your internal world, creating resilience against manipulation at both the individual and systemic level. One of the first practices in building this kind of mental autonomy is conscious attention management, which is the act of choosing deliberately where your focus goes, instead of allowing it to be hijacked by social media, news cycles, gossip, or emotional drama. Attention is the currency of your life, and the more it is scattered, the less energy you have to engage with your own reality. By observing where your attention goes, you begin to notice patterns of influence, habitual reactions, and invisible nudges that have been guiding your decisions without consent. You start prioritizing experiences, information, and people that support your growth, insight, and emotional stability. And over time, this selective focus becomes a protective shield against both external and internal psychological manipulation. Another essential step is the cultivation of emotional literacy, which is the ability to recognize, name, and navigate your emotions without being overwhelmed by them. When you can feel fear, anger, sadness, joy, or desire without reacting automatically, you regain the space needed to respond intentionally rather than being pulled by unconscious triggers. Emotional literacy allows you to see the difference between genuine signals from your intuition and manufactured responses planted by outside influence. You begin to notice when guilt is being used as a leash, when hope is being exploited as a trap, and when validation is being sold to you as a necessity rather than a choice. With this awareness, your emotional autonomy strengthens, and the most subtle forms of manipulation lose their grip. You also begin to develop the habit of questioning narratives, both internal and external, because most influence thrives in unquestioned stories. Every belief, assumption, or emotional reaction is a candidate for examination. You ask, does this really belong to me? Am I acting from clarity or fear? Who benefits from this story being true? This critical questioning does not create cynicism. Rather, it creates discernment, a mental lens that allows you to see the patterns that were once invisible. Over time, discernment becomes automatic, and you no longer take things at face value, because the world is full of seductive illusions designed to trigger compliance, fear, or distraction. Another powerful practice is the intentional cultivation of internal values, which are the principles that guide your behavior regardless of external influence. Values act as a compass when social pressures, emotional manipulations, or systemic patterns try to pull you in multiple directions. When you anchor your decisions, relationships, and actions in clearly defined internal values, rather than external expectations, you reclaim the decision-making power that was quietly eroded over years of unconscious influence. This makes you more resilient to guilt, manipulation, and comparison, because your actions are evaluated against your own standards, rather than the fluctuating moods or expectations of others. Equally important is the conscious creation of supportive environments, because even the most disciplined mind is vulnerable if it remains surrounded by triggers, toxicity, or unconscious influence. You begin to curate your social networks, digital consumption, and physical spaces in ways that reinforce your clarity, emotional stability, and growth. This does not mean cutting people off indiscriminately, but it does mean recognizing when influence is consistently disempowering, draining, or manipulative, and taking steps to reduce its impact. By shaping the environment around your mind, you create conditions where conscious choice is possible and unconscious control loses its foothold. Perhaps the most profound shift occurs when you integrate observation, awareness, and values into habitual practice. Because at that point, your mind no longer reacts automatically to fear, desire, or approval. Instead, it responds from a place of intentionality, insight, and grounded self-trust. This is the stage where influence loses its power, not because you are distant or detached, but because you are fully awake to the patterns operating both outside and inside you. Your freedom does not depend on controlling others. It depends on mastering yourself, understanding the systems, and navigating the world with clarity rather than submission. Finally, the culmination of this process is a new kind of inner authority, which is not about dominance, ego, or judgment, but about the confidence that comes from knowing your mind and choosing how it moves through the world. With this authority, you can participate fully in life without being unconsciously guided by dark psychology, because every thought, habit, emotion, and social influence is now filtered through awareness and choice. You begin to act intentionally rather than reactively, to connect authentically rather than compulsively, and to create rather than merely consume. This is the essence of mental freedom, the state in which you can engage with the world without losing yourself, and the ultimate defense against the invisible forces that once shaped your mind without your consent. As this understanding settles, you realize that dark psychology does not have to be a source of fear, but a tool for awakening, because the very knowledge of these patterns is what gives you the power to reclaim your autonomy. Every manipulation, habit, or hidden influence you uncover becomes an opportunity to strengthen self-awareness, practice discernment, and cultivate a mind that cannot be easily swayed. You recognize that the world is filled with invisible forces, but you are no longer a passive participant. You are a conscious navigator, capable of seeing the currents before they reach you and choosing your direction with clarity, courage, and purpose. And in this place, you finally understand the deepest secret of dark psychology. Its power exists only when you remain unaware. But the moment you see it, study it, and understand it, you are already free. Freedom does not come from avoiding the world, controlling others, or escaping influence, but from mastering yourself, choosing consciously, and reclaiming your mind as your own territory. This is the ultimate revelation, the final insight, and the lasting empowerment that transforms fear into clarity, vulnerability into strength, and awareness into liberation.